L'chaim, everybody.
L'chaim. Okay, good tavoch.
L'chaim.
Shavua tov. Welcome to everybody as we continue the weekly journey in Torah studies on the Parsha. So, as we know that there's certain things that are kosher to drink and certain things that are not kosher. Certain things that are kosher to eat, and then, of course, things that are not permitted. Wearing clothes, certain things that are appropriate, not appropriate. Shatnez, a mixture of linen and wool. And then there's certain things we could say and certain things that we can't. Now, so in every area of life, there is that which is permitted, that which is not permitted. How about, and excuse me, if I ask you, where you live, is it permitted to live where you live? You know, are you allowed to live where you live? Don't get nervous. I'm not a slumlord that's going to kick you out of your, I'm not that you live in a slum, but I'm not a slumlord that if you live in a beautiful place that I'm going to kick you out. Not spiritually or not, or otherwise. But there is the concept in this week's Parsha of a place where we're not allowed to settle, where we're not allowed to live. We're not allowed to put down roots. And where is it? None other than Pharaoh's land. You might call it living in denial. Sure you've heard that from me before, from others, right? The place where we were enslaved 3,300 and over 30 years ago. Yes, a place called Egypt. So today we're going to explore this idea of what it means of a place where we're not to dwell. What is the practical implications today in particular? And most importantly, what's the message that we can learn from this? Can I have a show of hands? Anybody that's living in Egypt today? Anybody? No? No one's coming from there? I think there was someone.
Oh, Rabbi, we're all in Galus.
So you want to say we're all in Egypt, huh?
We're all still in Egypt.
We're still in Egypt. Gotcha. Okay. All right, but let's explore this idea, the prohibition. And we see that it actually comes in this week's Parsha, but not in an obvious way, but in a roundabout way. And it comes with the mitzvah of Soim Tosim Alecha Melech, that you should place upon yourself a king. When the Jewish people will want to have a king, they'll come to request one. When we settle in the land of Israel, this king should be a humble servant of God who's inspired by the Torah, a true God-fearing individual who will lead the people. There are a number of restrictions that the Torah speaks about in this parsha about this king. He's not to marry too many wives. Even though today Ashkenazi can only marry one, right? But that's only a decree that was in the last 1,000 years. Before that, according to Torah law, you could marry more than one. That's a different discussion. We won't go there today. You can't have too much wealth. Wealth, yes, but not too much wealth. Because ultimately, it may corrupt him. And therefore, although he needs to have great wealth, but not to such a degree where it could be corrupting his divine mission. And another restriction is that the king is not allowed to own too many horses. Now, before we get into the horses, Got to tell you, when I was a kid, I don't know, 13, 14, 15 years old, I used to go horseback riding. I used to compete with horses. I enjoyed horseback riding. I don't know if any of you have been in the on a horse before, but there is a chush, there's a talent in how to ride a horse. And perhaps it's, one of the talents we need in life. Okay, today we've replaced it by driving a car. We no longer. But driving a car is not a talent. Actually, the Rebbe once said that his father-in-law was a Muslim. He was complete. He was complete. So complete means that you're complete in all areas of human excellence. So he said that in reference to, but he didn't drive a car. So you don't need to be complete. You don't need to drive a car in order to be complete. Now, I don't know if anybody here is 16. You can get your driver's permit here, at least in Quebec, I think it's 16. And, a 16-year-old, they feel they get completion because they got their permit that they can drive. Right? I'm complete now. I can drive. But no. So, but that being said, back in the day, concept of a horse, but a king cannot have too many horses. So let us review this. Okay, one moment. All right. See the screen?
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. When you will come to the land the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and live therein, and you will say, I will set a king over myself like the nations around me. You shall set a king over you, one whom the Lord your God chooses. It's interesting. So God chooses the king. But just parenthetically, for a king, a Rebbe is a king. He's a melech. He's not a king in the biblical sense of of how the king is appointed with anointment and so on and so forth, as King David and so on. But he has the quality of a king. And with this, we can understand that for the first year after the previous Rebbe passed away, the Rebbe would constantly say that when people came to him, they wanted him to be the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, at the Nishki Kragena Hayra, he did not get authority. Like he didn't get authority. He didn't get trying to find the right word. What he was alluding to is, I didn't get from on high, or from any place for that matter, the permission, because it doesn't come from you. It comes from on high. And we see this by the king over here, that God chooses from among your brothers, and shall set a king over yourself, and shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself who is not your brother. Only he may not acquire many horses for himself, so that he will not bring you back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way anymore. So why the prohibition of many horses? So Rashi elaborates upon this. And as the verse says, that you shouldn't return that way anymore. He may not acquire many horses for himself, but only what he needs for his chariots, so that he will not cause the people to return to Egypt to purchase the horses, because horses come from there, as it is said of Solomon, and a chariot that went up and left Egypt sold for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. So Egypt is a place of horses. So if the king is going to have an impressive selection of horses in his stable, and it'll be now something to trade, to make a robust horse trading industry with the king and the people. So ultimately, this will lead to the possibility of Jews settling in the land. Okay, so what do we get from this? Not to have too many horses, so that way the people will not return to the land of Egypt. So the obvious question, why? What's the problem with returning to the land of Egypt? Why is there a prohibition to go back to the land? So we go back to the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. He says, the 46th prohibition is that we are forever forbidden from living in the land of Egypt. The purpose of this prohibition is so that we should not learn from their heresy and not come to imitate their behavior, which the Torah considers wicked. The source of this prohibition is God's statement, exalted be He, you must never return on that path. Excuse me. The Rambam qualifies the law, explaining that settling in Egypt is what's not permitted. However, can you visit? Can you do business? Is that permitted? So the Rambam says, however, one may go there for business or to pass through to another land. The Judaism.Talmud says clearly, you may not return to live there, but you may return there to do business and trade or to conquer another land. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions so far?
Rabbi, I'm confused. This is Moses telling us about the fact that we're going to be getting a king. But I thought later in Samuel, there's a warning that if you want to get what you want, you'll be like the other nations.
Actually, it says in the verse here. Yeah, that's a very good question. If we can save that for later, we can discuss that, because I will go off on what we're discussing now. But that's a very good question. All right, and we'll elaborate upon it depending on the time. Okay. Now let's go into another issue: re-Egypt, re-Mitzrayim. But some historical context we need first. In the 6th century before the Common Era, so how many years would that be? Over 2,500 years ago, when the first temple stood, King Chizkiyahu lived. He ruled. He was a mighty king. He was a good king. And he was challenged by a tyrant by the name of Sancheirav. He was the king of Assyria. He was making a major conquest upon the world. And of course, he had sight for the Holy Land, and this brought great panic amongst the Jewish people. It was Passover night, and his army was ready to make a siege, to strike, and Yeshayahu, Hanavi, Isaiah, the prophet, declared that God had listened to the prayers of Chizkiyahu, and the Jews were going to be saved. That night, midnight, same time as the angel of death came and killed the firstborn in Egypt, likewise the angel of death came and struck down the Assyrian camp. They died. And Sancheirav awoke and found an army that was decimated. Jewish people were miraculously spared. However, that did come to a cost, not to Jerusalem, but the entire world that he had started to conquer um, with great success and ruled over them, he imposed a widespread population transfer, exiling people from their nations. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to make sure there wouldn't be an organized rebellion against him. Now, that's what happens when you conquer people, right? Over some time, they organize and they rebel against you. But if you displace them, what happens? Why is there a rebellion? How can there be an organized rebellion? Well, when the people are there band together because they have a national identity, because they have a national culture, they have some kind of bond between each other. So then there's a much greater likelihood that they will band together and create this rebellion. But if you make a population transfer and put some of the people in one country, some of the people in another country, and so on and so forth, this will mitigate the chances of a rebellion. Pretty brilliant piece of, I guess, of warfare, strategic warfare, right? Now, why is this relevant? Who cares? What has this got to do? Well, it has to do with an interesting halacha. The Torah tells us there are 4 nations that we do not accept their people to convert to Judaism. Now, we do accept people to convert, right? As a matter of fact, someone who converts to Judaism, there's an extra mitzvah to love them. You have to love them as a Jew, but you also have to love them as a convert. Double love, right? But 4 nations that are not allowed to convert. We won't get into the reasons for that right now. Egypt, Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Now, what happened with Sancheirav, he conquered these nations and therefore displaced them. And as a result, these 4 nations are no longer, for all practical purposes, not allowed to convert. Then anybody comes from these 4 nations. So they can be married. You can be married to, if they convert, one can marry someone from these nations. As the Rambam says, when Sancheirav, the king of Assyria, rose, he confused the identities of all the nations, mixed them together, and exiling them from their place. The Egyptians that live in the land of Egypt at present are of other nationalities. This also applies with regard to the Edomites in the field of Edom. Inasmuch as these 4 forbidden nations became intermingled with all the nations of the world with whom it is permitted to marry once they convert, all converts are thus permitted today. For when any one of them separates themselves from them by converting, we operate under the presumption that they became separate from the majority. Therefore, in the present age, in all places, whenever a convert converts, whether they be from Edomite, an Egyptian, an Ammonite, or a Moabite, or Cushite, or from any of the other nations, whether male or female, he or she is permitted to marry among the Jewish people immediately. Of course, they have to convert according to halacha, according to Jewish law, right? Is that clear? All right. So if Egypt's current status is that you can marry someone from Egypt if they convert, doesn't it also impact the prohibition against living in Egypt today? Remember that what was the reason you can't go back to Egypt? Because of the culture, because of the people, the wickedness of the people, not to learn from them. Well, if what we just said, that these Egyptians that are there today are not the real Egyptians, that we were once there and lived there 3,300 years ago, if they're not the real ones, so it should be no issue. And we don't see that the Rambam makes any mention of this. He's silent. However, if we look at the Talmud isn't silent about this. It actually makes it very clear that Egyptian residence does apply today, even post Sancheirav, Bilbul Ha'olam, that he mixed the world together, he mixed the cultures and the nations together, so they're not really the original nations. But according to the Talmud, it seems to still apply. As the Talmud tells us, there was a great Jewish community in Egypt, in Alexandria. Thousands of Jews live there. Tens of thousands of Jews live there. As a matter of fact, they had such a huge synagogue there that thousands upon thousands of people, that from the beginning of the synagogue to the end of the synagogue, it was so large that when the Chazan would pray with a loud booming voice, he could not be heard to answer Amen. So they would wave flags when everybody would need to answer Amen. That's how large it was. Eventually, and there's a little confusion, not such great clarity on this, that it might have been Alexander the Great who actually exterminated and got rid of the Jews there in Alexandria, which is called after him, Alexander the Great. And the Abaya in the Gemara tells us that what happened to them was a result of them being in a place where they shouldn't be. Abaya said all the people who congregated in the great synagogue were killed by Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Why? It was due to the fact that they violated the prohibition that you shall henceforth return to no more to that way to Egypt. And they returned. When Alexander arrived, he found them and saw that they were reading the verse of the Torah scroll, God will bring a nation against you from afar and from the end of the earth. As the vulture swoops down, a nations whose tongue you shall not understand. He reasoned, Alexander, I sought to come by ship in 10 days, and a wind carried it. And the ship arrived in only 5 days, concluding that the verse applied to him. He set upon them and slaughtered them. Alexander lived about 200 years after Sancheirav displaced nation upon nation. And according to the Talmud, in this instance, the prohibition still applies. And therefore, and as Abaya explains what happened to them. Now, this is one question, and to get into, we need to understand what's going on over here with what happened to them and why should such a thing happen to them. But another question, or the question that we're going to deal with is, what's the difference between these two prohibitions? That in Egypt, you could marry an Egyptian, but you can't go back there. If the reason you can marry the Egyptian, because it's not the original Egyptian, so then if it's not the original Egyptian, then why can't I go back to Egypt? What would be the issue in going back to Egypt? It's not the original Egyptians. I'm not going to learn from their wicked ways. So it's not a problem. What's the difference between the two prohibitions? Is the question clear? Yeah?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to leave that on the side for a moment. Okay, so our issue is, just to make sure, Egypt. You can marry somebody from there because they're not the original ones, even though the Torah tells us that they shouldn't come into our congregation, shouldn't become part of our people, a few generations, whatever. But you could, not a problem. Why? Sancheirav, he confused the nations, he displaced them. They're not the original. Well, if they're not the originals, then why can't I live in Egypt? What's the worry if the problem is I'm going to learn from their evil ways? Okay. But now let's address an even more perplexing question. So we saw about Alexandria from the Talmud and what happened to the Jews there. But that's not the only instance. Throughout history, Jews lived in Egypt. Not only they lived in Egypt, they thrived in Egypt. Bustling Jewish community in the first Holy Temple, like we just learned about. But there was throughout. When the Jews were evicted from Spain in 1492, many went to Egypt. When the Suez Canal was built in 1869, it led to easier access to get to Egypt. Many Jews went there. Eventually, a lot of Jews, until 1948, the establishment of the land of Israel, modern day state, there were always Jews in Egypt. Furthermore, I mean, there's even Jews today, not that many, but there are even Jews today. But okay, so you might say maybe those were people who were erring. But let's look at not just Jews, but let's look at some very well-known great Jews, like the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel was one of the leaders of the Jews who led the Jewish people out of Spain in 1492. Well, he went to Egypt. The Radvaz, student of the Rambam, went to Egypt, lived in Egypt, had a yeshiva there. And the Rambam himself, he lived in Egypt. If you want the elephant in the room. So there are three popular answers to give us an understanding. How is it possible that Jews did in fact live in Egypt for centuries upon centuries, and yet it was okay to do so, even though we learn very clearly that there is a prohibition. So one of the Tosafos, Rabbi Eliezer of Metz, who lived during the times of the Rambam. Some of the Tosafos were the grandchildren of Rashi. So he explains that the prohibition of living in Egypt is not merely about living in Egypt, because let's go back to today's verse. Let's go back for a moment. What might not grow many horses, so he will not bring you back to Egypt, right? Back to Egypt. Back from where? Israel, the Holy Land. So if you're going from Israel to Egypt, there's a prohibition specifically in that manner. But if you're going from Spain to Egypt, you're going from Morocco to Egypt, there is no problem. Rabbi Eliezer of Metz, let's read it inside. I have seen and heard of many great Jews who went to Egypt. I was puzzled. How did they justify that? Perhaps it can be explained that since the verse states that you shall not return that way, it only prohibits returning from the land of Israel to Egypt. But to move there from other lands is permissible. Support for this is in the story of the biblical Daniel, who traveled from Babylonia to the Egyptian city of Alexandria. So a clear distinction. It depends where you're coming from. And with this, then we can understand why the Jews in Alexandria, this was in the times of Alexander the Great during the first temple. So they most likely moved from Israel to Alexandria in Egypt. So then we can understand what happened to them. That's one explanation. Another explanation is offered by the Radvaz, who lived several hundred years after the Rambam, who also lived in Egypt, and says that the prohibition is about a long-term settlement. But if you're there temporarily on business, now we already got that idea from the Rambam. He said if you're there temporarily in business, but he says if you came for temporary purposes but ended up being there long-term for whatever other reasons that kind of forced you or whatever. In other words, you didn't proactively go to settle in Egypt to be there and that's my place of settlement. You only went there and got kind of, ended up there. Like, some people, it happens. You come to a place, you like it, it's great, business is good, you're flourishing. So you end up staying there. And then it's not a prohibition if you went in that manner. But if you uproot from your place to go there specifically because that's where I want to be, then there's a prohibition. The second generation won't be a problem. Why? Or the third generation, because they were born there, they didn't go there. So there wouldn't be a prohibition for them. And with that, we can understand how many communities grew and flourished in Egypt generation after generation. And the Radvaz brings another explanation to justify being in Egypt. And this is particular to the Rambam, Maimonides, because Maimonides, he served as a private physician to the Sultan of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, which means it would probably be nearly impossible for him just to pick up and leave. So he would be what we call in the category of an onus. The Radvaz, he says, as for our teacher, Maimonides Rambam, could have settled in Egypt, we can answer that he was forced by the government to remain there, for he was a physician to the king and the ministers. I too lived in Egypt for quite a while, studying and teaching Torah, and in fact, I established a yeshiva there. This was permissible, and I therefore, I don't understand this, I therefore relocated to Israel. I mean, I don't think it's I therefore. I don't know, the English is incorrect because I'm looking at the Hebrew. Vishuv, it doesn't say therefore. Vishuv Vasili Yerushalayim, and later he says I relocated to Jerusalem. It's not therefore. It's a wrong translation. When Menachem Begin was going to go to Cairo to an unprecedented trip to Egypt for peace talks. So then it became a big question, and it came to the Sephardic chief rabbi at the time, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Can you go there? Can you not go there? So he included many of these things that we just learned over here. And there's, you're allowed to go. You're not going there for permanence. So it became a lengthy discussion, and it was in the media, with journalists going, and so on and so forth. And he said it was absolutely permissible that one could travel and go there. As he writes, it's permissible for Israeli journalists to travel to Egypt to cover the peace negotiations with our neighbor. Okay, now we have a pretty good picture on how the Jews lived in Egypt, with a wide range of rabbinic discussion as how this was allowed. But let us go back to our original point. And if we factor in the Sancheirav disruption of nation after nation, and here in our particular interest, that of the Egyptian nation. So if we can simply assume that you can marry an Egyptian today, that converts because they're not the original Egyptians. So why can't we just give the same blanket permission? And we don't need all of these other explanations. Blanket permission to live in Egypt because it's not the original Egyptians. Plain and simple. Okay, we're good. Any questions, any comments before we get into this? Everybody's with me? Can I get some thumbs up so I can see that everybody's is paying attention here? Just didn't show their picture here. Showing your, there we go. All right. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. All right. So we're going to now get into something that might be a little, excuse me, I just need to get something. I'm putting on my Talmudic cap. Thanks to Davida and Liba. Thank you.
Wearing and tearing in good health.
Amen. Thank you. Because I need this now, because we're going to get into some deep Talmudic ideas. And it may be a little hair splitting, but, bear with me. Okay? Maybe I should keep it on. Maybe it'll, it'll be inspiring. So let us go into an interesting issue in halachic principles. Now, this is very important. We Jews are principled people. And what does it mean, principled people? There's principles that we guide our lives. And I don't mean ethical principles here, but Torah principles on how we learn Torah. And of course, ethical principles, that goes without saying. But I'm talking about here, when we study Torah, study Talmud, so we need to know principles and apply principles to various halachic issues. So, what happens if you're in a place that there are 10 butchers in your town, your village, your town? 9 of them are kosher. One's not. And one is not. And you found a piece of meat. Now, I'm talking about principle here based on biblical law as opposed to the final halacha of what to do. The final halacha is rabbinically is one thing, which we'll get to. But now on principle, what do we say? Is it kosher or not kosher? Anybody? Don't speak at once. Please. Be, is it kosher or not kosher?
What is that? We're guessing there's a 9/10 chance that it's kosher.
I didn't ask you if it's 9/10. Is it kosher or not kosher? Can you eat it or not, biblically? Yes
No.
or no?
We don't,
No,
Why?
Because you don't know.
because you don't know.
Take precaution, extra precaution.
That's not okay. That's not what we call principle. I mean, that's what you're saying is actually true rabbinically. Rabbinically, you're not allowed to eat it. Why? Because it's kosher what comes in our mouths, we got to be very strict and we've got to be very careful, and therefore not allowed to. 100% correct. It's only rabbinically. Biblically, you would be able to eat it. Now, we don't live our lives based on biblical law. We live our lives according to halacha. So halacha is very clear that we're not allowed to. Again, as Ahuva said, correct, because we're not certain. And because it is about, you are what you eat, kosher is very important. And therefore, we're not allowed to. But that's only rabbinic law. Biblical law, there's a principle called majority. And this then falls under the majority rule. The majority rule is that it is all in likely intents and purposes, it came from 9 out of the 10 kosher ones, and therefore it's permissible. Again, don't go eating it when you find that piece of meat, right? Because halachically you're not able to. Now, obviously, if you can prove it that it's not kosher because of the kind of cut it is, or that it happens to be, chazer, pig meat, right? Then obviously not. But if it's meat from a kosher animal, so that's what the halacha is, right? However, now let's take it differently. What happened? The same 9 stores that are kosher and one that's not. And I bought meat. And I don't remember which store I got it from. I don't remember. It was a confused day, right? And I don't know. So what would the biblical law be?
It's okay.
No.
It's okay. Ahuva says okay. Celia, you also say it's okay?
Yes.
Andrew?
Well, from what you told us, it's okay biblically.
I think I need to buy you some caps. Anybody? Dissenters? Any dissenters? Saul? So here's the story, folks. Kol ha'perish, anything that is separated from its original place, then we use the principle majority is what is is guiding us, because it was removed from its original place. If it's not removed from its original place, it's in the store, you just don't remember which store, then we call it mechsa am mechsa. That it's kavua, because it's set, it's in the original place, and therefore it has a half-half. It's either kosher or not kosher. And since it's 50-50 possibility, we declare it biblically that it's not permissible. Let's take a look. I know I confused you all. That's good.
I don't understand.
Let's look inside from the following applies when there are 9 stores selling kosher meat and 1 that sells treif, meat found in the market of such a town or in the possession of the Gentile non-Jew is permissible by biblical law because most of the stores sell kosher meat, right? We got that already. Now, he says the following applies when they are 9 stores selling kosher and 1 selling non-kosher meat. If one purchased meat from one of the stores and it is unknown which store it was purchased from. Now, why you wouldn't know, that's irrelevant. This is about principles. We're learning out a principle in halacha over here. It is forbidden. For when something is fixed in its place, we assume a 50-50 chance of its permissibility. So it's kol kavua kemechsa al mechsa is the Hebrew terminology. So since it is fixed in its original place, so it's a 50-50, and therefore it's not permissible.
What do you mean it's fixed in its original place?
It was in the store where it comes from. It wasn't separated from the store and found in the street or in someone's hands. Okay?
Yeah, but he couldn't remember which store it came from.
But it came from a store. That's the point. It came from its fixed place.
Oh,
That's the
it
point
comes
over
from a
here.
fixed place.
It came from a fixed place. Finding it in the street is not a fixed place.
So that's permitted.
No. Listen to the logic. Follow. It's a principle. It's a
Right.
principle. In a fixed place, we say it's either kosher or not kosher. 50-50 chance. Therefore, we make it 50-50 because it's in its fixed place. Once it's removed from its fixed place, then we go by majority. In other words, we don't use the majority rule when it's in its fixed place.
Okay.
We only use the principle of majority when it's removed from its fixed place. The piece of meat was not in the store, it was found.
Right, got it.
It's a distinction. That's called principles in Talmudic thinking. Now, we're not going to go into the great depth. What does this mean? And so on right now. Time won't allow for that. But that's the principle. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Just let's understand the principle on its own. Why we won't get there now. Let's accept it. Okay. Now let's apply this logical parallel to the Egyptian living in Egypt. So what did we establish? Sancheirav mixed up the nations. The majority of people living in Egypt today are real Egyptians? No, they're not. Thus, we can compare it to a town where most of the stores sell kosher meat. The question is it presumed Egyptian in Egypt considered in her place, like meat purchased in the store? Or is it more analogous to the meat found in the middle of the street? You follow? Let's see. Let's see one opinion called the Lavush. So he says, although Sancheirav uprooted the nations and placed others in their stead, a minority of Egyptians certainly remained in their place. Thus, an Egyptian in Egypt would be considered in his original place, and therefore the majority principle cannot be applied. Because it's Egypt. So Sancheirav did remove, right? Maybe 90%. But 10% was there. He didn't remove everybody, right? It wasn't necessary to do that. So let's say there was only 10%. So we have the majority rule. No, he says we don't have the majority rule. Why not? Because it's the Egyptian in Egypt. So we can't use this principle of majority. Because when, just like the piece of meat in its place, how do we look at it in the butcher shop? We don't look that there's 9 kosher butcher shops and therefore I don't remember where I bought it, but there's 9 of them, so most likely it's from a kosher. We don't use the majority rule. We don't use that principle. Because in its place, we consider it kavua, set, and therefore it's kemechsa al mechsa, it's 50-50, and therefore not permissible. Okay. So now the question is, how about, then why can we marry an Egyptian? Why can we marry an Egyptian if we consider them an Egyptian in Egypt? Nevertheless, says the Lavush, this individual who now converts is considered to have left his place. And the rule is that when something is no longer in its place, it is assumed to be a part of the majority. Therefore, they are permitted immediately. So in marriage, when it comes, we do look at the majority. Why? Because there's a possibility here of this person converting. Converting means, boy, did you leave your place. All right? You become a Jew, a Jewish soul. So because of that potential and that reality, therefore, it's considered like you left your place. Left your, not physical place, but left your space, so to speak. And therefore, it becomes permitted that you can marry an Egyptian. As the Rebbe explains. On the basis of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch rule that today an Egyptian convert may marry a Jew, because the very act of their conversion, they have left their place. In contrast, the other Egyptians who remained in Egypt, though they are a minority, are considered fixed in their place. Therefore, because of them, the prohibition against settling in Egypt so that they should not learn from their behavior remains in effect. This is clear. Remember, it's about applying a principle. Now, again, we won't have the time to go into depth to appreciate the nuance of this principle, right? But there's an idea of when you are set in your place, you're set, right? Kavua means it's entrenched in you. That's right. You look at things in one manner, but when you make a movement, when you're not in that original set place, so then we look at things differently. We look at that reality based on majority, and therefore gives us a greater potential, perhaps, right? So that's part of the concept over here. So let's take this home. An important lesson in life. So I think, Andrew, you mentioned before that we're still, we're in Golos, we're still in Egypt, right? Correct. Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim comes from the word Meitzar, which means restrictions, constraints. It actually means constraints. A constraint is a restriction. So what does it mean to return to Egypt? We left Egypt, but the prohibition is about returning to Egypt, right? So what does that mean? You came to the Holy Land. You are embracing your new inspired life of connecting to God, fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. You are giving yourself over to it. And at the same time, what are you doing? You're looking behind you, over your shoulder. What did you leave behind? I came from in Egypt. I left it behind. The fact that we're looking behind and we feel that we left something behind in our former lifestyle, what does that mean? It means you didn't embrace it. You didn't fully embrace your new lifestyle, your new identity, the new you. Which means you really didn't leave. You still feel that there's something there. The pharaohs are coming after you. So this is what the Rebbe explains. One whose Torah's observance lacks passion hasn't fully left Egypt, inasmuch as he takes no pleasure in spirituality, but does everything only because he must. He automatically is being chased by Pharaoh and his army, who wish to enslave him again. In other words, he confines Egypt, right, of the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, the animal soul, still have a hold on him, limiting expression of the divine soul. So real freedom takes place only when we realize that the only way to go is forward. When you realize that you don't need to have Egypt in you, and you don't want any part of Egypt to be a part of you. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have struggles, you're not going to have difficulties, but you don't want to have this. So now we can bring these two ideas together, actually. You can marry the Egyptian, but you can't go back to Egypt, right? What does this mean? What was the distinction? Going back to Egypt, it doesn't matter if there's a majority of a minority of Egyptians there, because it isn't, because it's an Egyptian place at heart. You can't go there, period. There's only one remedy: to leave, to convert. The only way Egypt is no longer a part of the person. That is the only conceivable way for an Egyptian person to fully marry the Jewish way of life. So a person might think, well, the majority of my life is Jewish, but, I still have, the Egyptian ways within me, which means you're making a calculation. Most of my life, yes, is, a Jewish life, but, I leave some of it for my Yetzer Hara, for the Egypt in me. What does that mean? You really haven't left Egypt. You're still living in Egypt, because it's not about the majority. The majority principle doesn't apply for living in Egypt. So you need to get out of Egypt, not based on majority. And that's an interesting idea, that every time we have a struggle, we need to know it's a 50-50, right? 50 doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing. Majority. What do we tell ourselves? We're all human. We all tell. But the majority of the time, I do good to you. I'm so nice to you majority of the time, my dear spouse, my dear child. Okay, so I slipped up this one time. So when it comes to Egypt, when it comes to the Yetzer Hara, when it comes to evil inclination, you can't say to yourself, well, the majority of time. Yeah, but this time you slipped. This time you slipped. So you have to look at it 50-50, right? Not as a majority. There's no majority rule over here. Every time there's a battle between my godly soul, animal soul, between my good side, my lower side. And when I see it as a 50-50 battle, then in each time I can leave my Egypt. I'll be able to rise above. But as long as if I'm thinking of it as a majority, so then I'm not really, we've missed the message. We're not really leaving Egypt. because then majority of the time I'm good. So why are you the majority of the time good then? For God's sake? Well, for God's sake, then it's not about a majority of time. Then God wants us always to be good. That doesn't mean you don't fail. It's about a commitment to something. It's about a commitment to something. It's not about, we're human, we will fail. How do you look at the failure? If you look at the failure as, well, the majority of the time I'm okay. Now, it's not about coming down on yourself that you're no good. That's not the point over here. Oh, I'm a failure. It's not about being not about a failure at all. It's about the ownership of it. So if we look at our lives, the majority of our lives, we're pretty good people. We treat our loved ones the majority of the time good, right? And therefore we can feel good about ourselves. We give a pat on the back, on our shoulders, that we're pretty good. Is there a truth to that? Yeah, but that's not how we should look at ourselves. We're not supposed to return to Egypt. We're living in the good land, the holy land. In other words, we have a holy soul. So look at it as 50-50. Majority of my time. No, that's not how to look at it. Don't look at your life that way. If you look at it 50-50, that means every instance in life is a struggle between two sides. The majority, I'm a winner. That's God who will judge you, but we're not into the judgment stuff, right? We're not into the judgment day, even though it's Rosh Chodesh Elul and a new year's coming. We're not here about the fear of God that he's a punishing God. That's not Jewish. It's another faith that believes that stuff. So, but we are responsible. And where do we take that responsibility? As when it's set in us. We didn't just separate from somewhere. We didn't just we're a piece of meat found on the street. We're not a piece of meat found in the street. We're a life that's found in our source. In our source, connected with God. And therefore, everything becomes, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, everything for the Beinoni, and that's who we are, Beinoni in training, because I think all of you learned Tanya with me. Right? What are we? Who are we? Beinoni in training. What does that mean? The Beinoni sees everything in a very binary way. Connect, disconnect. That's mechsa al mechsa. That's half and half. Is this connecting me or disconnecting me from God? Very simple. And that's the view. How do you see that? When you're kavua, when you're set, when you're in your source, when you are, right? When you're in your source, that's how you're going to see it. When you are a piece of meat on the street, and that's how you see yourself. It's just a piece of meat. So then you're going to go by majority, right? Then you're going to see, meaning I just hear happenstance. I got separated. I'm disconnected from my source, from my original set place where I come from, right? We all come from a butcher shop. Right? That's the metaphor over here, right? And we are now, we feel that we're just a piece of meat, another piece of meat on the street. And the majority in this town, kosher. That's not a good way to look at our lives, because that's not the way our lives really are. When we can look at this way, so then everything becomes binary, everything becomes not majority, becomes this or that, connect or disconnect. And then we're not viewing, I'm generally a good person. No, I'm not here to feel good. I'm here to do good. So right now, the do good is mechsa, 50-50. So I got to make the right choice. That's the lesson. Powerful lesson. Chaim. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts? Not all at once. Single file. Andrew, go for it.
Since we're really technically in Gullus and we don't have the third temple, aren't we kind of like the lost meat? So shouldn't anybody, even if you're technically in Israel now, be permitted to go back to Egypt?
Are you talking for the metaphor purposes, or are you talking about?
Yes. Yeah.
No,
And from what you're
God-
telling
God
us, we're,
forbid, God
I mean-
forbid, God forbid that that's how you should look at yourself. Exile, what does exile mean? Exile just means the presence of God is not obvious in our lives, right? Gola, right, which means exile, means the presence of God is not apparent in my life, not obvious. Geula means with the same letters as Gola, but with a letter Aleph, representing God, Alufa Shalom, the ultimate God Almighty, meaning that God is present. So just because God is hidden in exile, does that mean I should hide from him and feel that I'm separate from him and just another piece of meat? Or am I a lost piece of meat, or am I set in my place connected? That's the choice we have. Just because we're in Gullus doesn't take away. What's one of the metaphors that the Alter Rebbe uses in Tanya for exile? Son of the king who's in prison, right? What does it mean as son of the king? Did he lose the right of being the son of the king, the prince? Not at all. He's still the son of the king. He just can't exercise the full capacity of being in the palace of the king, but he's still the son of the king. He is still exactly the same person. He's just imprisoned. So we are the exact same person. We're just in prison. We're in Egypt, but that doesn't mean that because God is not apparently revealed in our lives, doesn't mean that we are not connected to him and now try to extricate ourselves from imprisonment. And every time when we see ourselves as that piece of meat that's in the street, that's in prison. When we look at ourselves as that we're set in our original place, right, in the shop itself, in the heavenly, and the heavenly place where our soul comes from, that we're bound up in our set place. So then we will make the right choice and we'll be released from our imprisonment in that moment. And we won't be in Gullus in that moment. Okay, that's real tzaddikim. They don't live in Gullus like we do, right? They don't live. So in the moment when we do the mitzvah and we do the right thing, we also don't live in that moment in Gullus. We're beyond. You know, we still are affected by it. We're not righteous, but in that moment, we rise above. Okay? Anybody else? Question, comment, thought? Powerful idea here.
The analogy is a bit of a brain twister.
Yes, it is. I must admit. Here, put it on. Put it on.
Talmud, yeah.
But the message is clear and directive.
You made it palatable.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So
Thank you very much.
we will continue our learning tomorrow morning, some more Tanya, tomorrow afternoon, some more Rambam, and of course next week. All right, folks. Thank you for joining. God bless you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good Tavach,
Thank you,
Shabbat Shalom.
Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi
Rabbi.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
God bless you. God bless you, Rabbi Fine,
Thank
and
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi Fine. Thank you, everyone.
Be well.
Thank you. Shabbat Tov, everybody.
Shabbat
Cheers.
Tov.